there were like three themes of the day, I think, roughly. Esther may or may not agree with me. The first one was to kind of hear voices from the ground and to, to kind of see why we do what we do and why what we do is kind of important. The second bit, which was the previous 2 hours, was kind of thinking about where we are, what are the things where we need to be. It was a little bit more kind of work, trying to figure out, what have we been doing right, what have we been doing wrong? And then I think this final session today is something that we had tried at JPAL at 10, which is to try and figure out, are we reading the tea leaves well? How did we get to this part of the journey? How are we going to get to JPAL at 30 if we are still around here by then and AI has either not exterminated us or something, which was my previous session. And so this is a very informal sort of a conversation. The way I thought I would do it is we would just kick off with a few questions. We'll ask each other some questions, and then we'll open it up for you guys to ask us everything from Esther to Walter White. Okay, so Ben, maybe I'll start off with you. When Rachel and you guys did this at JPAL at 10, the question was, what is the one thing that you're most proud of in the first 10 years of JPAL? So let me probably ask you, for the second decade of JPAL, what is it that you're probably most proud of?
So, I mean, there's lots of choices, of course. One thing I think that maybe surprised me, but maybe it shouldn't have surprised me, but I think is really something I'm really proud of, is our alumni network. Like, in some sense, we talk about, if you think about all the things we do, we explicitly put a lot of effort into, doing the research, doing the policy, policy outreach, doing training. But I actually think another really big way that we have impact over the long term is through all of the, now hundreds, if not thousands of people who have come through and worked, with our huge affiliate network on all those things, on all those various research projects or in the policy group or whatever, some of whom are still with us, which is wonderful, and some of whom have gone off to all kinds of, I think, incredible roles, but having that interest in evidence and understanding of rigorous evidence and even, desire to do RCTs and bring that kind of evidence into their life. And I actually think that if you think about our long run impact, I think a lot of it will come absolutely from our research and our direct policy scales and our direct training efforts. But I think there's a fourth piece of it that I don't think we'd really realized at the beginning. But now that it's been, through our second decade, we've started to see that happen. So to me, like, that's something that I don't know that we necessarily explicitly thought of. I mean, part of a little bit we did, but I think it's really been really exciting to see that happen kind of over the second decade of JPAL, and I think something really that we only had this time to see. So that's one of the things I would pick. Esther, what do you think?
I guess I'm more grateful than proud for any number of things that has happened in the last decade. But perhaps the thing for which I am most grateful is that from the core that we had built as a solid research organization with a good but not enormous network of researchers doing good work, we have evolved in sprawling networks, which we have called, with Abhijit and Michael, a movement, which includes not just a much more diverse set of researchers, but also activists, people working in NGO, government workers, and governments themselves, which has given us the possibility to expand, I think, beyond certainly my wildest dream when this all got started, in terms of both in terms of scale. We do mention the number of lives saved. That comes not from our work, but from people taking up our work and extending it, and but also in terms of scope. We used to be working in kind of even 10 years ago in sort of the traditional research domain for people like us, and I think we expanded beyond what I could possibly have imagined, and this would not have been possible without the incredible success of people have latched on the model as something that they can be part of, and that they can contribute to, and that can in turn contribute to them. And that is something which I just think we were extraordinarily lucky that the chip fell this way. We were lucky, and I think I want to think the world was lucky in that I think the product is beneficial. How about you?
Yes. Well, so my answer is probably going to be a little boring, but that's what management is about. But I think, when we were at JPAL at 10, the other day somebody was asking me what's been the big difference between decade 1 versus decade 2. I think when a lot of us joined JPAL, or a few of us who are still left joined JPAL, most of the work was being done with nonprofits. It was being done with small NGOs around the world. And one of the things that happened in that panel between Abhijit, Ben, Esther, and Rachel is that they laid a clear vision that, if we are going to have a bigger impact and impact at scale, we will have to really redefine the way we work with governments and increase much more with governments. So that was all nice and cool, but then we had to build and modify the organization to be able to do that. And actually, what I'm really, really proud about is how we have done that over the last 10 years. I think just on the demand side, first of all, the phone rings, and the phone rings because of the brilliance of the researchers and the creativity and the name recognition and the hard work done by the staff. But then once the phone rings, how do you kind of strategically decide which phone calls to then kind of follow up? Where do you have the capacity to do, and how do you do that? And then more importantly, very much like Esther said about the crouching tiger thing in the morning, the opportunistic relationships, they come. It's very easy to say, you should grab the opportunistic things, but to be able to grab the opportunities, you have to have the right team in place, the right attitude in place, the exact things that you need. So that was on the demand side. So then what do you do on the supply side to be ready to kind of jump? I think the first thing which has been really path-breaking for JPAL has been the initiative model, which allowed us to have the funding in place, thanks to an incredible set of donors, many of you whom are in this room, to allow us to fund research at literally in a heartbeat. So the best example of this is COVID. When COVID struck, surveys were shut down, the fieldwork was shut down. But at the same time, so there was no demand for doing RCTs, but there was tremendous demand to understand what is happening in the field. And so, for instance, Ben and Rima were approached by the government of Indonesia to understand are people listening to the COVID messages in the villages and the districts, and how are they responding to them? And we basically were able to repurpose a lot of the initiative money to kind of say, we'll even just do survey work. The second thing has been the diversifying of our research network. So when the phone rings off the hook, one of the things that continuously Rachel and I used to bring to the board is what happens when the phone rings off the hook, but there are not enough researchers to jump on these opportunities. So you've probably seen that in this really beautifully designed document by my colleague Lucy. The number of researchers has gone up from about 8 at the starting to about 800 in our network. And that has required a lot of work to make sure this network grows both and diversifies. So that has been fantastic. The staff has stepped up to the plate. And I think all of this has led to a bunch of government partnerships, embedded models, and all of those really fun things. So personally, I'm very proud of it. But Ben, on your point, I would love to see, by a show of hands, the alumni in this room, JPAL alumni, because I know we have a bunch of JPAL alumni. So just to all of you, thank you so much for everything that you do and you do every day. Okay, Esther, the next one is to you. So I'm sure this may happen to you, although Nobel laureates get asked less direct questions than poor folks like me do, which is a bunch of people have asked me that, okay, JPAL, the P in JPAL stands for poverty. So what is JPAL doing, kind of working in climate, now thinking about the intersection with AI? Are you having a mission creep? Are you distracting from the model and getting away from poverty?
A great question. Just as I came in, I was having a discussion where someone was asking me about science, and actually not skeptically, but saying that's an interesting way to think about poverty. And it was an interesting question because that's a question that we did ask ourselves before getting into, jumping with enthusiasm into this new initiative led by Paul and Heidi on the science of sciences. Well, is it like mission creep? Do we move out of poverty? And so obviously we answered that no, this is fine, this is still within mandate. And like, of course, any work on environment, energy, climate is still within our mandate, because the notion of poverty, it didn't have to wait for us to think that poverty is a very multi-dimensional concept, and it's not just about income poverty, and being poor is so much about the opportunities that people don't have to realize their full capacity as human being. And therefore, the moment you want to think about poverty, you're going to be thinking about a lot of things, a lot of dimension immediately. And of course, as we heard today in the climate and environment session, the first people who are going to be most affected by climate change are poor people. And therefore, the moment you're interested in that, you start getting interested as well in the conditions that are necessary to, for example, limit climate change that are going to affect the poor. So you might end up doing a project on adoption of, I don't know, energy conservation behavior in rich countries, simply because we do need that to be fixed in order for the progress against poverty to be maintained. Similarly, we could be we have in JPAL a lot of projects on raising taxes. Ben here has a lot of them. Hopefully, we are not raising taxes on the poor. In fact, in developing country, really no one is really raising taxes on the poor. But government do need their tax revenues in order to fund the programs and policies that affect the poor. So I think eventually, I am the first to be worried about mission creep in a number of dimensions, but in terms of the themes that we have decided to absorb, I'm very comfortable. And maybe I'll leave Ben to talk about science.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, I guess in general, I mean, I agree with Esther. I think I have a very open view. I think that the world is pretty complicated, and lots of these things. I have two answers, actually. My first answer is this one, which is a lot of these things have poverty implications. I think firms, for example, if you ask what is the engine of economic growth, one important piece of in many like low and middle income countries, one important piece of it is like, how do we get firms kind of working properly? And if you think about what has been, lifted, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, it's been getting kind of firms to hire people and have growth and raise wages. So I think it's all. And a lot of these things, you can tell similar stories of it really is related. So I don't see it as a challenge. But actually, I want to make another point, actually, which is going totally the opposite direction, which is a couple of years ago, I was looking at all the different sectors that JPAL had, and we had like an agriculture sector, an education sector, and we had a health sector, and a governance sector, and so on. And I was like, wait a second, we don't have a poverty sector. I was like, that seems like a problem. And so so recently, actually, Rima Hanna and I have sort of started leading a social protection sector, which explicitly tries to focus on the set of programs that are really explicitly about, how do we explicitly address issues of poverty per se, not through the other channels of education, but like directly think about both people who are in poverty and how can we alleviate them, and also think about social insurance issues and how to prevent people from falling into poverty. So I think actually, in some sense, we were like, wait a second. In some sense, when we had started this whole thing, we were about poverty, but the idea that we were going to do it through these other like lenses into poverty was so baked into JPAL that actually we only sort of started directly having like an anti-poverty sector kind of recently. So I think in some sense, this idea that we're going to think about these questions holistically has been present from the beginning, although I think now we're also kind of directly addressing some of those poverty challenges per se. That's my take. Iqbal, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with all of the above, and I'm going to punt on that one, so that we have time for more.
Okay, well let me ask you a question, Iqbal. So this is I guess your 6th year as the ED of JPAL. So thank you, and JPAL has grown really significantly since then. So how do you think this growth has changed the organization, and what are some of the new challenges? What's become easier, what's become harder? How do you think about, it's a lot bigger than we used to be, and how do you think about some of those challenges?
Okay, so I think the easier one is kind of what has become easier. I think when I joined 15 years ago, so much of the debate was still about, RCTs and experiments, about the methodology. I think thanks to all the work that has been done by the researchers in the network and where RCTs are in the field, I think what has definitely become easier is that most of us who are at this, in management and staff don't have to fight that battle, and the researchers got that victory for us, got that battle sorted out. I think I can bore you with a lot of things about what has become harder. That's generally what I spend during my performance review every year as well, to try and convince them that I still deserve the job. It's everything that comes with the scaling up of the organizations, more staff, more researchers, and therefore diverse needs. It's the stuff that comes with the organization which is becoming more complex, going beyond just research and beyond just policy to evidence to scale and training. But I think most of you are kind of familiar with that. I think the question that I actually find very interesting is what has not changed about J-PAL, and which continues to be actually a big source of strength. And I think I would rather just focus on that one. And I think there are 2 or 3 things. The first is the distributed leadership model of J-PAL that was put in place right at the beginning and which has continued throughout. And what do I mean by distributed leadership? I think the first aspect of the distributed leadership is the faculty and the staff. I see plenty of academic centers around the world which just are set up to serve one purpose, which is to serve the faculty to get more of their research out. I think what has been unique about J-PAL is that it has given an opportunity to a whole generation of folks like me to have an equal say from the beginning to the end into the mission of the organization and how we accomplish that mission. So I think we see that still today. At the regions, you have the scientific directors, but you have the EDs. Every vertical is led by our staff. Every sector has sector chairs, but it also has sector managers. And I think that distributed leadership has been fantastic. The second thing that has not changed, and President Susan Hockfield is here, who was kind of instrumental in making this happen, which is that MIT was able to think of J-PAL as beyond MIT. Our network of 800 researchers, I would say maybe 15 or 20 of them are from MIT. The rest are not from MIT. And I think that has been a huge strength of J-PAL. And for that, I want to thank MIT and President Hockfield in particular. Thank you very much. Okay, so no more questions from us. We are going to hand it over to you for a little bit, and maybe if, come back if there are more questions. I have plenty of questions, but I'm happy to defer first and see if you have questions. We have microphones all around the room. Please raise your hand. Ask anything you want from Esther, Ben, or me. Unfortunately, Abhijit could not be here because of a personal emergency, but we'll try our best to sub for him as well.
In the meantime, I'll mention one more thing that hasn't changed in J-PAL, which is the huge pleasure that it is to work with the staff that we have in this organization. And every occasion we had, starting with yesterday's party, but every time we are in the field, and this is something which I'm sure Abhijit would have said, every time we have kind of the pleasure to spend time with the staff, which happens quite a lot, he comes back to me and said, aren't we lucky that we get to work with these people? And I think that has been phenomenal.
Okay, so there's a hand here. The reason we need a microphone is so that
you're in the video.
Yes, exactly.
I'll be quick. For all of us that were not able to attend the AI session, can you give us a short synopsis? Thank you.
Yes. Okay, happy to do it. While and so please tee up your questions in the meantime, and we'll get to it. Okay, so we had a really fantastic session. We had 4 panelists. So we began with the macroeconomy. And said, what are going to be the impacts on the macroeconomy of AI? And Geeta Gopinath, who is the first Deputy Managing director of the IMF, took us through the lens of what is going to stay the same in terms of regulation, what is the sort of smart regulation that countries need to do. The main message there was you need coordinated regulation, because if you don't have coordinated regulation, one particular agent can bypass the entire system. She talked about the impacts on the labor markets and the fact that what was surprising to me is that there are far more jobs which are exposed to AI in a way that we haven't thought about. And so literally, I pulled out an example myself of a professor who just posted last night saying that I don't know whether we will need RAs in the future, because the work that I used to give to RAs in terms of data analysis, and it used to take hours and hours, I actually tested it out, and ChatGPT was able to do it in 10 minutes. So I think, there was a whole set of examples on that. And then David Otter, who's a professor here at MIT and one of the preeminent labor economists, dived into kind of what has been the evolution of AI. Are we too afraid of AI? There have been technological changes in the past. He talked about how we, went into the industrial revolution and then the computer revolution, and we survived that and survived that well. So why are we worried about here? And then he answered his own question. He said, well, the reason we have to be worried about is because, in layman's term, AI has a brain of its own, and it's evolving, and it's getting to a stage where we are transitioning from a world where we knew a lot, but we could not. There was no way for us to teach the machines enough about, we could teach a machine how to do 2 + 2, but we couldn't tell a machine, that when you look at Amy, you should smile, or, the pictures, the emotions that Amy you got into all of us in your presentation in the morning, like we couldn't teach. And he said, we are now flipping to a world where the machines actually know more than we do. And sometimes we guess this is why the machine must be telling me I should do X, but we don't really know. And I thought that was kind of a really cool movement. And then we had Bridget from Google.org, who gave some fabulous examples of how AI in social good is transforming the world. The example that I really liked is extension workers. Earlier, you were capacity constrained in terms of the number of extension workers you had in agriculture and what knowledge they had. And now these AI can substitute for the extension workers and also give far more customized information based on the local conditions. Then we were very fortunate to have the Secretary of the Indian IT Department, S. Krishnan, join us at 12:30 his midnight from India to talk about how India, the largest democracy in the world, is thinking about AI. And David had set us up very nicely by saying, democracies use technology much better than dictatorships do, and what are the implications of that? And so he gave us a number of examples, but also talked about how LMICs are very concerned about the fact that the computing power sits in one country of the world, America, and in future it will sit in the EU. The models are being trained on data which is American data and European data. And so if you think about it, all the biases that we have and the preferences that we have are getting transferred to those models. And the third thing is about data privacy and security of their own citizens, and how do these things all evolve together. And then I'll just tell you self-servingly what my conclusion was. I gave a presentation about how J-PAL is using experiments, but if there was one common theming among all of these sessions, it was, we don't know. We don't know how AI is evolving. Will it be a force for good or a force for evil? And how do you make the good dominate the evil? And I think that's exactly what J-PAL has been good at doing. It's basically saying it's an unknown. Let's experiment and evaluate the hell out of it and get to an answer. So sorry if that was a little longer, but it's a question I get asked all the time. So I was really happy for it to be answered by such a wonderful panel. Okay, so if folks can just raise their hands, and then we'll get 3 or 4 questions going, and then happy to answer. All right. It looks like Amy did a good job in prepping me with backup questions. All right, so then, Esther, maybe I shift back to you, and then I have this question. Kind of, what is the one thing looking forward to the next 10 years that you're really excited about? And perhaps conversely, what is the one thing that you kind of a little bit worry about?
Yeah, so you teed it up nicely by saying, at JPAL at 10, we were sitting, I remember, on extremely uncomfortable high chairs. And I was quite pregnant
You
with
were
my
8.5
son,
months pregnant.
who was here today. This is much better. But despite that, we had some thinking of, okay, the next step is really going to be, if we want to go from JPAL 2.0, is going to be going to through government in order to have real scale-up and adoption. So in anticipation of JPAL at 20, I've been giving a lot of thoughts to what's the next, not just to what my remarks here, but what we actually need to do now. And the opportunity / worry is that who is going to do this work in the future? And I think it is very, very important, both for the actual research work, the work in NGO, civil society, etc., and the work in government, that there is significantly much more capacity to analyze data, to look at, to rigorously look at, even to think about policy design, and of course to do RCT than there is today. Because it's not the graduate of the few policy school or a PhD program or master's program in the US or Europe that are going to do all of this research, nor should it be. I think there is a very natural demand for a lot of the research that takes place all around the world to be done by people who are from all around the world. I don't think only Brazilians should work on Brazil and Americans should work on American, but I think Brazilians should work on America and French people should work on Brazil, and the research capacity should be so much more distributed around the world than it is today. And so I think that's the opportunity, and frankly, this is the opportunity to go to go from 650 million life affected to 1 billion life affected, because you need so many more champions at all levels of society. And one thing that that we have not only been thinking about, but started to work on, is how do we reproduce, if we are successful, that networked idea of JPAL for research into a networked idea for education. So a few years ago, we launched a program, a MicroMasters, thanks to the MITx platform, which is a MicroMasters on data development and economic policy. This is MIT level classes that people can take online on their own time. And then we use that as a way to get for admission to MIT, and we have a spectacularly amazing cohorts of people. Several cohorts of people have come through this program and are now gone all around the world to do good things. So that's past. Moving forward, what I think is really critical is to use a similar model to do that in various universities around the world. So we don't have 20, 40 people coming to MIT, 100 at the Kennedy School and whatever, but we have, hundreds and hundreds of people trained in the various local organizations. There are great schools all over the world, and with a little bit of scaffolding in terms of good training, we could train hundreds of policymakers at all levels, people who will end up being in city government, district government, national government, students, future researchers, people who will be working in think tank and organizations. So my dream is not so much that we disappear. I kind of still hope we have JPAL at 30, but that when we celebrate JPAL at 30, will be kind of the flagship of such a larger sea of people doing this kind of work, each in their own organization. And thanks to Community Jamil, we are able to start this effort. So we have a core team led by Anna Schrimpf that is already starting this effort. We have one partner already with whom we are working closely, which is the NCA in Côte d'Ivoire. But my hope and dream and my work, my single-minded work for the next few years is definitely to extend that network model to the education. So think of it as, how do we square it? At JPAL at 10, we squared it by going to government. Now we are going to square it again by creating so much more capacity to work with government and organization and do the research itself. So that's my hope.
So, I mean, first of all, I echo that. I think that's absolutely fantastic, and I think that I agree with you, Esther. That sort of there's a question. You know, what's the worry? The worry is actually maybe that there's more, that demand exceeds supply. That we actually are more able to generate kind of demand for the work than we have for supply of it. So I completely agree with Esther. That sort of the way we can think about how do we scale that is going to be really important. But I wanted to put another thing on there as well, which is I've been thinking a lot about what you said about sort of, you know, if at 10 we said we want to do governments as sort of a way to scale, I think we have a lot more to do there in a particular way, which is I feel like right now we have a few examples of success where we have some examples of success. Obviously we've hit 600 million people, so it's a lot of success. But I think it's still, very much driven by, it's not automatic. Like, I think it's driven by sort of us, finding the right people and working together and collaboratively developing things. And I think we have, we have islands of champions of evidence in some governments. But what I think I want to think about is how do we build the process of, bringing evidence into policymaking and bringing that into scale in a more systematic way. And we have examples where we have kind of these lab models where we've sort of, in some sense, pilot tested. How do we do that? How do we create an institutional framework where governments come and say, here are our problems, and we can say, here are the answers, and then we test the ones we don't know, and sort of at least to scale. We've sort of pilot tested that model, and I think it's really, really powerful. But I think there's, if we think of the fraction of governments that have adopted it yet compared to what it could be, it's pretty small. So I think that sort of, to my mind, the next challenge is sort of saying we've figured out that in fact working with governments is a pathway to enormous impact and enormous scale. And I think the next question is, like, how can we take this model and scale it up so that kind of not automatic, but a little bit sort of like self-sustaining policy impact in governments can be scaled throughout the world. So I think, to me, that's another challenge I would put for our next 10 years.
Okay, fantastic.
I think there are some questions. No?
April, did you want to answer that
I'll
question?
let you
Sure. So can we get the mics to where the hands are? And in the meantime, I'm happy to. I think kind of one of the things that I'm super excited about it. Yes. Yeah.
Let's save your answer.
Yeah,
I'll save my answer. Rachel, go for
I
it.
don't want to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but I'm interested to hear from each of you one thing where the evidence has changed your mind in the last 10 years. So, what's something that you were surprised about and you think about very differently because the evidence has come out?
Whew. Okay. That's actually a really fun one. As Rachel, I'll start and then let the others come in since I'm in the hot seat. So I think it was basically 10, 15 years ago, as the cell phones, mobile phones, the connectivity was becoming really, really strong. There was this entire sense that technology can solve a lot of problems. And I was very fortunate to work with Rima Hanna at Harvard on this evaluation, which basically said, look, the problem is that the doctors don't show up for work. And the nurses don't show up to work in remote rural primary health centers. Nobody knows whether they show up for work or not. Let's install these biometric devices, connect them to a mobile phone, and boom, like in real time, the secretary of the health department in Bangalore knows which doctor came at what time, and this is kind of going to solve all the problems. And I think that was a Kool-Aid, very much like the one laptop thing that everybody drank. And I think the power of the RCTs was here, not only finding that the technology did not work, but why it did not work. And I think for me, the big insight was, again, on hindsight, this is all obvious, that the non-technology factors are so important in making sure that the technology succeeds. In this particular case, they had a shortage of doctors. There was not enough political will to enforce the penalties. And so you had this weird situation, and I think you've done work which was similar earlier with Seva Mandir. You had this weird situation where now the people in Bangalore knew that which doctor is not showing up, not doing anything about it. And when the doctors and the nurses find out that part, they're like, geez, like we were showing up for 3 days of a week, and we were for 3 days because we were worried somebody might take action against us. Now they know that I'm absent for 2 days, and they're still not doing anything about it. And so maybe I was a fool to come for even 3 days. And so I think there is some learning for that for us, even about the AI things that I was talking about earlier. There's this sense that AI will kind of control us, but maybe we can control the way we use this AI, and this AI bit is not going to be successful unless we understand how it works with the broader ecosystem of the people, the policies, the political compulsions, and the capacity constraints that Esther talked about earlier. But Ben, how about you?
Okay, well, it's a great question, Rachel. I have so many answers. I have to pick. I'm actually going to probably pick two because I can't just pick one. But so actually, on the first one answer I give actually to some, like when I talk to some of my students, is actually also on technology, but with the other side, which is kind of when I first entered this, like cell phones or whatever. I kind of thought for like typical, really poor, say farmer or something in one of these lower middle income countries, like. There was a lot of hype, but I was like, no. Like, I just did not believe it. And like, I did not think this was actually going to be relevant. They have such first order problems. I just didn't think that the cell phone was actually, or those basic technologies were actually going to be really impactful. And I've just been completely persuaded by the evidence that like, I was wrong. And maybe it's obvious to the rest of you, or you were all like technology, enthusiasts and you weren't surprised, but I was like, just in terms of like how I've like thought about, how I've taught this stuff and how it's changed over the times I've been doing it, like I've totally updated. So I agree with Iqbal, it's not a panacea. And a lot of times it doesn't work, but I've just seen examples of, price information or whatever, like just like people are actually like really able to, who are including like the very poor, are able to use technologies in all kinds of ways that didn't really affect their lives in ways that I was surprised about. So that's number one. I'll give another example, which is, we heard earlier about the ultra poor graduation approach. Like, I'll just tell you, like, I was surprised. Actually, this literature has shown that now in like many countries, that somehow this combination of things actually can have really transformative impacts on people's lives. Like, not just 2 years later, but I think in some of the studies like 6 years later, right? And or even longer, I think, in some of them. And so, I think that some of those things were, at least to me, like it actually in that one, I think it opens up another set of questions actually, which is like, what is in the secret sauce, and how do you, how can we do it more cost effectively, and does it actually? I don't think it's right for all people, and how do you? I think it opens up another set of questions. But like, I think the evidence is really persuasive, and like at least changed my mind. And I think so those are just two examples. I could probably sit here. We could probably talk for an hour on this question. I have a bunch of other examples. Those are just two that I thought at the top of my mind. Esther?
I think a piece of context about me is that, unlike what Bengt says, I don't have very many strong opinions about most things. That is actually true. I have opinion about process. I have very strong views about how you get to the truth, but I really don't have much priors about most things because I know the world to be a mess. so I tend not to have very strong views about what things should be, and therefore I'm also not very surprised. I kind of move with the flow. That makes my life easy because I'm rarely disappointed. Because whatever. But with that said, one surprise to me, and I think in that sense, I've moved with the flow, and the rest of the world on that, is the whole cash transfers. When I started doing development, we just didn't give cash to people. It just wasn't a thing, and now it is a thing, and I think I've learned a lot about that people kind of use the cash very well. And one thing that did surprise me a lot, especially given my previous work, is that you give it to men, you give it to women, you have the same impact. That kind of surprised me because that doesn't sit with other things I knew about the dynamic, the gender dynamic within the family. So I haven't fully understood yet why it works this way, but the fact that cash can be used, and in combination with the technology, that's another kind of plug for the technology, in combination with the technology, cell phone transfer, targeting via doing cheap targeting with cell phone metadata and satellite data and so on, has really changed my view about, in fact, social protection. I don't think of cash transfer as a kind of permanent, certainly not as a panacea and not a permanent way for people keeping people out of poverty. But along with a lot of African governments, for example, have started to think about cash transfer as a very important tool in our arsenal. And it's something, I can't even know that I changed my mind. It was just absent from my perspective some time ago.
But, okay, I just want to jump in on that one. Actually, so I had the opposite prior. Like, I thought cash would be great. It would be very effective, and it turned out to be very effective. So, like, but actually, I think that but actually, that's a kind of a point that I want to make, which is that actually one of the values of kind of this kind of evidence is that, like, you know, we can come at this with different priors. Like, I thought cash would be really effective. She might have thought it was not very effective. And, like, you know, we could, like, you know, sit and, like, argue back and forth, or actually we can actually, like, run a study or a series of studies and actually get an answer that we can all kind of believe in. And, like, you know, I've been right on some, I've been wrong on some, and the whole point is actually that, like, we can take these, like, it's not really about our priors, what we were surprised on. It's about kind of, like, getting to the point where we can all agree on what the facts are.
Great. Yeah, go for it, please.
Hello. My question is to Esther, that we are talking about poverty, and I think this is the the biggest problem of humanity. And it's a complex issue. But even if it is a complex issue, the one major reason behind poverty is the unequal distribution of the wealth. So 1% of population is holding more property than 99% of the population. So how do you address this problem? Do you think about some redistribution, or maybe even we are in democracy, and this democracy for decades, many decades, but still we couldn't, we are going through this unequal distribution of the wealth. So how can we overcome this situation? So if you would like to.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and we are not going to answer it alone with the set of tools that we have. I think that's a question for a lot of people, for historians, for political scientists, for economists. What we can say about it, we can still say things that are relevant about it. First of all, we study taxation. And we study how we can we can implement the taxation preferences that a particular society has. And we can also look at whether such taxation efforts are distortive and to what extent. And it's very informative in the policy debate to say that you can take money away from rich people without much economic cost or with a lot of economic cost. It's important for society to decide. And just the mechanics of taxation in developing countries, as Ben could elaborate on, is pretty complicated. So there is a lot to do there. So that's one thing. And these are inputs into this debate. The other thing I think where we have a role to play, and a lot of sort of my advocacy hat is around redistribution and climate justice, is to say, look, if you had money to give to people, you could give it in ways that would be useful to people. It wouldn't be, because often an answer is, oh, if you take money away from the rich and you try to give it to the poor, it's going to make the poor lazy, and in addition, it's going to be wasted, and it's going to be corruption, and therefore there is no point even trying. And with our work, we can say, no, you can do this, and you can do that, and you can do that, and in fact, even corruption can be studied, and you can structure your programs to avoid corruption, and so on and so forth. So we, as running randomized controlled trials, working with partners who do it, we are never going to be substitute for the political debate. That's not our job, that's not our place, and it's not a place that I want in the world. I think there is a reason why there is democratic debates in societies. But on the other hand, the inputs and the hope that we can give that, look, there are things you can do, and they are effective. You can give cash to people, you can do ultra-poor program, you can give money to people before the drought comes, and that is super effective, and so on and so forth, can actually inform that debate.
Great. Can we have a show of hands as where are the questions so we can send the mics over if there are questions? Yes, there's one here. Any others?
Next.
2. That's great. Okay, 3, perfect. So if you can all pass the mic along, we'll take all the 3 questions together.
Yeah,
it's not yet working.
No, it is.
Okay, no. Let's get him a different one, Michael. That one is not working.
I think it is working.
Or it might be off. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so I had a question, something more related to the experience of going to different parts of the world and researching. So, like, for you, like you talked about a lot of your work in Indonesia and you like different parts of Africa, India, like across the world. Like, what were the different things that, you got attached to more from a cultural perspective, maybe? That did you have certain attachments beyond just, the research that you did when you actually ended up going into those countries? Like, any examples?
Okay, if you could just pass the mic behind you. Go for it, and then pass it to Jess.
When you shared about your epic failures, Ben, you mentioned that there are research questions for which there are no like natural experiments. I'm curious about what research questions are on your wish list that you wish there would be situations that you could
Take your notebooks.
My question is getting at Ben's point made earlier that RCTs came from the medical literature, and just thinking about the multidisciplinary research that J-PAL has always engaged in, but my question is, where do you see multidisciplinary research in J-PAL's future?
Great, 3 fabulous questions. Pick whichever you want to answer.
Well, maybe maybe I'll start with the question about like what are the research projects I'd like to do. I have a whole folder on my computer called like ideas looking for settings. I'd have to go back to my computer to find all of them. But let me just. So here's one example of a project I always wanted to run. So actually, the initial now I mostly work on sort of these like taxation and social protection issues primarily, and some environment issues. But the first topic I worked on a lot was on corruption, and the project that I always wanted to run, which I think someone has run a slight version of, but I don't think quite the same, is the idea that if you could change the bureaucratic structure. So in some places, if you want to get your driver's license, you have to go to the particular driver's license office for your district, right? So that they have a monopoly power, right, in some sense, and so they can extract a lot from you. In other contexts, like you have a choice. Like in Massachusetts, for example, where we live, like you can go to any registry of motor vehicles and get your driver's license. And so if one of them was charging a lot of bribes, you could just like go to a different one, and competition would sort of reduce corruption naturally. So that's a project that I've always been like kind of had in the back of my head of like, is a government willing to do that? And it's a good thing you mentioned actually, because this question of sort of having these ideas in the back of your head is actually very useful, because you never know kind of when they're going to come up. Actually, when I was actually running a J-PAL or teaching at one of our J-PAL exec ed programs, like, I don't know, more than maybe almost 10 or 15 years ago, we had group projects, and people sort of do various group projects. And one of the group projects was a project to do something, a study on sort of giving incentives, wage increases or incentives for tax collectors in Pakistan. And I went up to the person afterwards and was like, I've been like shopping this idea of like a randomized trial for like wages and incentives for tax inspectors, like to governments left and right, and nobody's bit yet. But like, are you serious? And the person who now has become my co-author of more than 10 years now, Adnan Khan, said, absolutely. Like I'm a former bureaucrat in Pakistan, and like I totally think we could do it. And if you're interested, like let's work together on this. And actually, sometimes having those kind of ideas in the back of your head, like you have to keep an eye out, but sometimes they come to fruition. So that's one example. I'm sure you have like other examples in your...
But before you do that, Ben, not to put cold water on your project, but in my previous life, I used to be a civil servant, and I was trying to reduce corruption in the district that I was, and there was corruption to get your birth certificate. And believe it or not, the amount of bribe you paid was exactly the same, not only within my district, but across districts. And there was such a strong network of collusion, and this is the set rate. And you also see it in a lot of LMICs in
so maybe it wouldn't work, and we'd be surprised.
Yes, exactly. Like, if I could go back 20 years, I would have invited you to test that in my district. But Esther, what's your fun research project, or the question on multidisciplinary?
I'll take the other two, maybe. So first of all, on multidisciplinary. So it's really across the board now. So we had a visiting student, the development team recently, talking to us, very interesting research. He has a background as a lawyer, and he was talking to us about things he wants to do with courts. And that reminded me that we had some law, access to law is a really difficult thing for poor people in rich countries, and for pretty much everybody in low-income country. And again, we talk about it at an abstract level, you know, institution, rule of law, etc. But then it becomes very concrete. That he was telling us that the court can take like months and months and months to give you a date, and then when you have a date, they don't have time to interview the witness, so you get another one in several months, and how to change that. So I think that's one. Something that I've become personally very interested in. So of course there has been a collaboration with psychologists for a long time, a lot in social psychology. I've been more recently with cognitive psychology, so the whole Primat Game project is with a team of psychologists at Harvard under the direction of Liz Pelke. And I think a lot of economists become interested in that, both for measurement and implementation. So there is an initiative on that within the Learning for All initiative. There is interest from a lot of researchers and from money, and so cognitive psychology. And then next step on psychologists, I think there is a much greater interest in mental health, both as a valuable outcome in and of itself. So not just something that is a way station towards higher income, but maybe something that we should care about per se. After all, we are about utility, so mental health, you would think, would be a component on that. And hence, proper measurement of mental health and intervention that directly target mental health. So like people in this room have worked on cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, since there are very, very, very few psychologists in poor countries. And that leads to collaboration with psychologists that are clinical psychologists. And that's that's, I think, a brand new set of collaboration. Of course, political science have always been a strong set of partners, and people who work on social network work with a particular set of sociologists. So this is on my list in terms of other academic discipline. I would say just the collaboration with policymakers as co-author. It's not an academic discipline, but it's another background, and we have a lot of papers where we have people, implementers, so either from NGO or from governments, and they bring in so much in terms of not just getting things done, but in terms of how to think about intervention, that I would also say this is also multidisciplinary in that way. In terms of, and Pascal, you want to add to this? Oh, no. And in terms of fun things, so as I said, you know, the great joy of my life is the people I get to work with. And so everywhere we go, it's just the people I get to work with. And honestly, I think it could be on Mars, like it would be just fine. So, and everywhere you get this kind of cultural you know, the culture seeps into this. So I couldn't say there is a specific one.
Let me give, but I'll give a couple examples.
But
no, just give one, because I have
but I have a particular fondness for Calcutta, which is the first place I landed to do research. I came at it thinking it was going to be full of people with leprosy lining up in the street one after the other. So I had a complete prejudice. And I arrived there, and I just fell totally in love with the city, and I've been since then.
Great. Well, so I was going to say one thing about the cultural question. I think one thing that is really wonderful about the way that all of our, I think, affiliates in our research network work is that I think that they do really invest in sort of getting to know kind of the places they're working in. So for me, you know, it's primarily Indonesia, where I've been working for, you know, more than 20 years. I've also worked in Pakistan, India, and some other places, but there I've actually worked with local collaborators or with collaborators who have deep kind of country-specific knowledge and who know the culture in those contexts. So either, for me, at least that's how I do it. But actually I think if you ask everybody in our network, they would say no, I've really invested in sort of understanding this particular place and know it really well, and therefore can design things that are kind of culturally appropriate. So just to give you one example, so I think, you know, we've done some work in Indonesia. I'm going to give you an Indonesia example. So on on targeting, how do you identify who the recipients for anti-poverty programs are? And we did an experiment on kind of community-based targeting, where basically we had the entire kind of sub-village, you know, identify kind of who was poor, who was less poor. And I'd spent a lot of, my previous work on village stuff in Indonesia, I'd spent a lot of time in Indonesian villages, so I had a bit of a sense of kind of how these local meetings kind of worked, and I had a feeling that this would be successful, I think, based on sort of that cultural knowledge. But when I described to, say, American audience what we did is we went to these village meetings and we said, please, like, we're gonna first brainstorm what do we mean by poverty. We're gonna explain kind of criteria, and then we're gonna go one by one. And it's like Ben versus Esther. Who do you think is poor? And then after we're done with Ben and Esther, we're gonna go to Iqbal. And who do you think is poor? We eventually had a rope, sort of put everyone up on a rope. And when I described this what we did to a lot of like audiences here, people would say, "You did what?" Like, but actually, I think it was culturally appropriate, and actually we measured it afterwards because we actually checked, and we had complaint boxes. We asked people. It was a randomized trial of that versus other methods. We asked for complaints. We asked if you liked this method, if you thought this method should be used again, and that community-based method was much more legitimate and accepted, and more popular on sort of every dimension we could measure than kind of other approaches. So actually, I think that was an example where our co-author, our Indonesian research team kind of worked with me and my collaborators, Rima Hanna, who's I think in the room, and some of our collaborators in the Indonesian government to come up with something that was culturally appropriate. But if we hadn't had that background, I think we might not have.
After one round of questions, I'll go back. Pascaline, I'll come back to you in 1 second, but in the meantime, I would love to hear from you about something. We're talking about successes and all, but failures. I think sometimes it can look like it's such a well-run organization, but just to give you a perspective, I meet with the three of them every month, and a few months ago, I started sending them an email, which was basically titled fun/what is going well at JPAL, because our entire hour was spent talking about what is not going well at JPAL and how do we kind of rectify that. So I just don't want to gloss over the fact that there's a lot of mistakes that we make, a lot of things that don't go well, and then we course correct kind of on a continuous basis. So looking back at the last 10 years or the last 20 years, what is the one thing that you feel that we should have done differently, could have done differently,
We're not prepared.
or maybe didn't go as well as we planned? And while you're thinking about that, to give you a little bit of bonus time, we will take Pascaline's question.
Okay, thanks. I was asked to stand up, so I'll do that. So I think it's amazing how much JPAL has grown and done a great job expanding the network, and what you're proposing, Esther, in terms of affiliating more institutions on the education side seems amazing to grow the body of people with skills and interest in generating more evidence or using more evidence. But one thing that concerns me about the future in general is when I look at the broader community and citizens, especially in high-income countries, I feel like there is a movement towards more inward-looking things, and people being less and less interested in, less and less trust in science and less and trust in the rest of the world. And so that's maybe a failure of, when I look at the number of undergraduates who are taking development classes, it doesn't go up. Even among PhD students, people doing development does not really increase over time. And so I guess what can we do to make the respect for science in general only grow, and interest in global development issues only grow? I want to put a word for Rukmini's idea about the Netflix series. I think it would be a great way. So is that something that you can start working on right away, please? I think it could make a big difference. But more generally, what do you think we could do collectively to try to help reverse course in terms of the way people are going in terms of thinking about
Maybe I'll just start, Pascaline. Like, I think the way I've seen it is sort of working with local champions and local partners. Like, honestly, I think that's so that it becomes not like us coming and bringing these ideas, but becoming kind of much more coming at locally grounded and working with local partners is a way of sort of establishing the Oh, people in the U.S.
Right instead of and not trusting science and evidence. That's
Oh, that's a harder one. I'll punt that over to someone.
Well, in the big scheme of things, it's improved. We were reminiscing with Jishnu and Asim that when we took development, Abhijit was teaching it to us. Between Harvard and MIT, it was Jishnu, Asim, Eliana, me, and Chris Poor, if anybody can remember Chris Poor. He's at the Asian Development Bank. That's it. And so since then, it has improved. So in the big scheme of things, the arc of history tends towards justice. I also think in the big scheme of things, people in the US and in Europe are just inward looking. Not people in this room, obviously, who are from the US and Europe, but in general, the public is. And they don't give any money toward, the ed budget are very small, and people think they are enormous, and people are not very interested in being, from COP to COP, we keep making paltry commitment to reduce emission and also to compensate developing countries, and we don't satisfy this paltry commitment. So I think that is, unfortunately, the way the world is. And therefore, it lands back on Ben's view, is that with the small, persistently fairly small set of people who have different views in developing countries, make the most of that by making sure that this is multiplied by people from all of these countries, which will build that capacity to do the work. And I think it's totally possible. I think that's the only way.
Also, at least in the research front, I'm going to challenge your presumption. I think if you look at the sort of, related to what Esther's saying, if you go back and look at sort of at least research and where it is, I think the amount of research that's happening in low and middle income countries has been kind of increasing pretty steadily. Certainly, if you compare it to what it was 20 years ago, or even probably 10 years ago, I think it's just vastly larger. So actually, if you think of the number of affiliates that we have, for example, that's been growing and and probably even growing at an increasing rate over time. So actually, I agree with you that at the broad level there are some challenges, but I'm not. But in terms of like the interest in doing this kind of research and being able to actually successfully do it with partners, like I actually think it has been growing.
Meanwhile, my background processor has been working on Iqbal's question, and I'll say one thing that's maybe like a personal mea culpa. There would be many, but I'll cite one, which is related to this, which is I think at the beginning we were very pusillanimous in terms of expanding the network, and very, very careful in terms of not growing too fast and keeping it like high quality in some sense. And I also was perhaps too pessimistic about the possibility to involve in a real way researchers in developing countries. In part, thanks to the experience you and I had together, Pascaline, about the not so successful attempt to do that. And therefore, I think I've been, we could have gone, we now, and it really hasn't come from me, it has come from wonderful people in the network, such as Tavnit Suri, Marianne Bertrand, and then your work in Indonesia, many others, to say we have to build these networks of researchers all around the world. We have to invest in them. And okay, the networks are not there today, but we have to make them happen. And I think this has totally changed the face of the organization in a very good way. And I think this could have happened earlier. And I take some personal responsibility for slowing it down and looking back at, we probably wasted some years there. But we are improving now.
Okay, it looks like Ben, you're.
I'm good.
Question.
I spent a whole lecture talking about failure.
Yes.
Like,
those were research failures. Okay, so then I should also answer the hard question. I think for me, it was climate and getting our climate sector up and going and getting the funding for the climate sector. I just wish we had been able to do that earlier. We tried for 15 years, and people were like, no, we already know enough about what needs to be done. And I think it needed somebody like King Philanthropy and Kim Starkey to kind of step in and say, we'll fill this gap. And I just wish we had gotten that climate money earlier. Okay, so with that, I think we are out of time. We want to leave a full hour for mingling and to say thanks to each of you individually. I just want to end by echoing a theme that I think has come out persistently during the day, which is J-PAL is what it is because of you. It is what it is because of the creativity of the researchers. It is what it is because of the commitment of the staff who give up really high opportunity costs to come and work with us. It is what it is because of the implementing partners who have an easy path to simply say, I'm going to roll this program out, and instead they delay it. And the policymakers who know they might get transferred in the time that we are running an experiment and could get the glory of scaling up the program right now, and instead they say, no, we're going to test this out before we do it. It is for donors like many in this room who could fund projects which have their names on it, projects which have a building, a ribbon that they could cut. Instead, they believe in funding hard science. So it's because of folks like you. It's because of alumni like you who, not only finish your stint at J-PAL, but go to really exciting organizations where you expand the work and sometimes do even more than we are doing. And I think perhaps the most importantly, it is because of the folks like the ones you saw in the morning are the survey respondents, the participants in our studies who just open up their doors, their houses to us. Think about how many of us even answer a 10-second survey on Netflix about whether you like the movie or not, versus these folks who open up their doors and sit with our surveyors for hours and hours on. So to every one of you who are here and who are not here, a massive thank you for allowing us to turn 20, because without you, we had no chance in hell. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.